Hey guys, it's Johan and Sean from Sabot Videos, and assuming everything has gone to plan, you're watching this video on November 11th, 2018, the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, but more importantly, Remembrance Day. We wanted to commemorate this event by taking the opportunity to check out one of the oldest vehicles in the base Borden military collection, military museum collection, and also one of the few things the French did during the First World War, which wasn't a terrible mistake. Naturally, that would be the Renault Ft right behind us, which represents the pinnacle of armor design at the end of the First World War, namely because of features such as its rotating turret.
Now, I would note, Johan, that this was not the first armoured vehicle to have a fully rotating turret. That honour goes at least as far back as 1905 with the joint Russian-French project called the Sharon Armoured Car, which did have a fully rotating turret. Exactly,
but we can definitely still agree on the fact that this was one of the first armoured vehicles to have a rotating turret, and the first tank in the world designed to be used as we use tanks today, and not as a land fortress. It was light years ahead in time compared to its competitors.
That light year jump is due, some historians think, to the fact that Renault began working on this design as early as late 1915.
Right, and because of that, when the French army released a contract for tanks near the end of the First World War, this vehicle blew its competitors out of the water and looked completely different. Compared to the Schneider CA-1 and the Saint Chamond tank, we would not even recognize those vehicles as tanks today, and it became a successful design.
Now, it was such a successful design that not only did it get used the width and breadth of Europe for decades, but it even saw service as far out as the Philippines and Japan.
Yeah, and even as late as after the Second World War, when some of these were actually used against Israel by Middle Eastern armies.
So what we have here is not, in fact, a Renault Ft, but it's an American version called the M1917 that we Canadians bought from them after the war as training vehicles. So why don't I take you through a few particulars of this vehicle. So here I am on top of the vehicle, and I'm going to take you through a wee look of the turret and the armament. On this particular M1917 we have an octagonal riveted turret, just due to the lower cost and ease of manufacture, whereas the original Renault Fts would have had a cylindrical cast turret. Now, speaking of the difference, there's one thing I must stress. There were so many different variants, so many different producers, that there's no uniform, this model had this, that model had that. So you have to remember that when you're dealing with the Renault. However, we can say that the two major armaments were a 37mm cannon in the male configuration or a machine gun in the female configuration. The final thing to note while we're up here is that, as you remember Johan stated, this is the grandfather of modern armor, and so we see in the turret and the surrounding area vision slits for the driver and the commander in that, allowing them to get full perspective in battle. So I'll just hop down and we'll have a look around the rest of the vehicle. So I'm just going to talk about two of the things that made Renault such a great vehicle and so mobile. The first of which is the design of this track. It was designed in such a way that it was kept in constant tension to prevent it from falling off, which was actually a major problem with other such vehicles of the era, constantly being detracked without enemy action, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, was a major problem. This design really just stopped that in its tracks. Now, if you'll follow me back to the rear of the vehicle, we'll talk about the other feature that made the Renault so very mobile. So, the Renault was designed to be used in swarm tactics, throwing a lot of light vehicles at the enemy rather than a few super heavy mobile fortresses. This piece here, as I'm sure many of you know, is one of the things that really enabled the Renault to fill that role. This is the tailpiece or the rear skid or the sled or any other of the 999,000 names it was known by. What this did is it lengthens the Renault without adding any significant amount of weight, allowing it to cross trenches, shell holes, or any other such obstruction that one might find on a First World War battlefield. This, in conjunction with an engine that has a really nice power to weight ratio and was also designed to work quite efficiently at really steep angles, enabled the Renault to be very mobile on such a unstable battlefield. So with that out of the way, why don't we go around the front and we'll have a look inside. Here at the front of this M1917, we can see that it was crewed by two people. One, a commander, who also served as the gunner, and the other being the driver. The commander made himself understood to the driver by the crude but admittedly effective means of a series of kicks to the back of the driver's seat. However, even with that, the compartment of a tank like this can get very messy and unsavory very quickly due to fumes and exhaust and smoke and whatever else have you. The Renault dealt with this by adding a ventilation system in the front that pulled air through and cleared out the compartment. Your job's a hell of a lot easier to do when you can breathe effectively and see just as well. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the operations for a moment that vehicles like this one would have been involved in. The Renault first saw combat at the Second Battle of the Marne, where a formation of 30 saw off a German infantry advance, but unfortunately, due to a lack of infantry support, they were unable to follow it up and really exploit the success. The war in the latter half became a war of movement as we see it today, rather than the stereotypical stagnant trench warfare that we think of as the First World War. This war of movement is where the Renault really proved itself. The swarm tactics it employed and the lightness and mobility of the vehicle really proved true. So you see now why modern armor almost entirely and uniquely descends from this really early model.
Right, so that brings us back to the reason of why we're here today, and that's to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War and Remembrance Day. To all of you current and former service members, thanks a lot for your sacrifice and thanks a lot for volunteering. It's because of selfless people like you guys that university students like Sean and I are free to study in peace and also to pursue our hobbies in any way we see fit, such as by making these videos. So thanks a lot for your service and sacrifices again, and have a good Remembrance Day, everybody. See you guys around.